Lively debate now on BBC Two as the election draws closer. Daily Politics with Joe Coburn.
Hello and welcome to the Daily Politics. The hunt for the network behind the Manchester bomber Salman Abedi continues as another arrest is made and the terror threat remains at critical amidst fear of another device. We'll bring you the latest. In the wake of Monday's attack, Jeremy Corbyn says we need a foreign policy that reduces rather than increases our risk from terrorism. Is the Labour leader right that the war on terror isn't working? We have their manifestos, but do the numbers in Labour and Conservative spending plans add up? And the southwest of England used to be painted yellow. Can the Lib Dems make a comeback in their former heartlands? All that in the next hour, and joining us for the whole programme today are Ian Collins. He presents a radio show on LBC, and Rafael Behr, who writes for The Guardian. First this morning, 8 men are now in custody in connection with Monday's bombing at Manchester Arena. There's concern that the bomb carried by Salman Abedi was not the only device made by the terrorists, which is why the terror threat remains at critical, meaning another attack may be imminent. This morning, the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, convened another meeting of the government's Emergency Committee, Cobra. Rafael Behr, we are still very much in the midst of this terror threat, with the threat level remaining at critical. How much support do you think the security services and the police are going to need in the coming days?
Well, obviously, there will be things going on behind the scenes that we simply don't know about. And you, at this stage, so close to the atrocity of Monday, and with that still very present in people's minds, I think the government and the security services are essentially just asking for our trust and confidence that they are sort of in control of events or doing what can be done. I think we're still very much in that place where at least the sort of the politics of this have to be sort of dialed down while we wait for the sort of the present emergency to pass. I noticed Amber Rudd on television last night saying she didn't expect this sort of critical phase where you have the army on the streets, for example, to last more than a few days. But inevitably, there will then become broader questions about whether the right resources have been allocated, whether the tactics and the strategy are the right one. But I'm not sure we're necessarily sort of culturally in that place yet as a country to start having a very heated political debate about that stuff. But maybe we are. I think that'll shift over the next few days.
And it's a difficult balance to strike because campaigning has resumed at a national level, and yet, of course, in all of our minds are the images after the Manchester Arena bombing and obviously the outpouring of grief that has followed.
In all of our minds, apart from the minds of Jeremy Corbyn, it seems, from the rather disgraceful episode that we saw this morning and his comments of using an attack such as this to further his election campaign, which clearly, whichever way you slice it, is exactly what he's doing right now. That is deeply unhelpful. I think the other thing, Joe, that I find interesting about all of this, and we see it every single time there's an attack, that very quickly the intelligence services pick up and make multiple arrests, which usually tells us they already know where many of these people are. If they already knew where many of these people were in the first place, and I'm sure we're going to talk a little more about this I think, later on. If they already knew, why were those people not already in custody? It's that kind of lack of any sort of coherent, common sense approach that I think most people are scratching their heads saying, we've done the praying, we've done the vigils, now can we have some action? Right,
you've raised that issue and you say at the moment we're perhaps not at that stage, but there is...
I think is, I mean, what's interesting is obviously we simply don't know the attacks, the things that have been prevented. And so there's no, to suggest that there's a sort of a simple template and that there was an off-the-shelf anti-terror response that could have been used but wasn't, I think really isn't necessarily
But we know that
much credit to
security services say there's 3,000 people that are of interest.
And
in
500 active investigations. I mean, that in itself, if you just look at the numbers, and you could argue that the security services are using that to some extent to call for more support and more resources. But if you look at that, Salman Abedi was known, but one of the 500 presumably, but his case was under review. People will ask questions about that.
Absolutely they will. And you have this problem, essentially, that the people can be suspected of involvement in activity without necessarily having committed any crime, and therefore if the call is that you somehow scoop up everyone who at some stage has been suspected of involvement in terror thinking, terror discussion, terror conversation, then there's a spectrum that bleeds into terror plotting. Oh, well, suddenly now you're a criminal and you can be arrested. So it's not necessarily as obvious as you might think to just say, well, we find everyone who's basically thinking rotten thoughts and either lock them up or
then you have internment, of course.
Exactly. So,
which nobody is arguing for. But by the same token, it does appear that there is clearly a lack of something nobody can quite identify. Everybody scratches their head, says kind words. We're all very sorry for what has happened. We want to make it right. We don't want to upset that particular community, etc. But nothing is really being done seriously.
Well, and these, no doubt, were some of the things, including the ongoing investigation, the fact that the police are looking for what they think is an extension of a terror network or some sort of bomb-making materials. Let's hear what the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, had to say after that COBRA meeting today.
Just chaired COBRA to get an update on the atrocious incident on Monday night. We know that 22 people have died and that there are 66 people still in hospital. Meanwhile, the investigation continues. 8 people are now in custody. It is a live operation and that will continue. In the meantime, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the police for the really good work that they're doing. JTAC have assessed that this level of threat should remain at critical while the operation continues. The military are continuing to support the police under Operation Tempora. There are 1,000 members of the military who are assisting in that. And I want to thank them as well for the great work that they are doing.
Amber Rudd. Well, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, is in Sicily this morning at a meeting of the G7 group of major advanced economies. And we're joined from there by the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar. What are we expecting to hear from Theresa May today, John?
Well, the G7 meetings, Joe, are going to start very quickly. They've just been gathering and watching a quite spectacular flypast by the Italian Air Force. Their first discussion is on security, on counter-terrorism, and there will be an effort to reach agreement on that, which I anticipate will be the case. There'll be a statement of agreement a little later on in the day. And from Theresa May's point of view, she wants to contribute her thoughts, and we've seen some of this overnight, on the importance of tackling online extremism. And so essentially getting the major economies to put pressure on internet companies to identify dangerous content, to block dangerous individuals, to report relevant content to the authorities, and just get more going on an international front to deal with what is an international problem. And she's been saying that the fight against ISIS has been moving from the battlefield to the internet. So clearly a relevant point, but it's a much broader confrontation than simply online.
Right, and what sort of support do you think she's likely to get from other world leaders?
Well, I'd anticipate a little later on in the day, perhaps this afternoon, there'll be a statement ahead of the end of this G7 summit by way of an interim statement, which will, I'm sure, state the agreement of the G7 leaders to work more closely together, to cooperate in confronting terrorism on various fronts. You could compile quite a long list of those areas for action, whether it is to do with tackling areas of funding, whether it's action and sharing intelligence, sharing knowledge and expertise in dealing with radicalisation. All of these sorts of things can be helped by one partner with another, as well as tackled inside a particular nation. And so there will be something of a joint front here at the G7, but it is an enormous, in some ways a growing problem, and it won't be solved here by any means.
Right. I mean, in some ways, you could argue that this might be a relatively small measure compared to what needs to be dealt with broadly, as you say, across Britain and the rest of the world. And warm words are one thing. Will there be any action?
Well, I think it's indisputably a small thing when you look at the scale of the problem. If you just take the heading of countering radicalisation in any particular country, that's a problem with very, very deep roots inside communities. You could argue, and people are arguing, about whether Britain's own way of dealing with this, the prevent strategy, is effective or ineffective. And in the case of Britain, I think there are good arguments to be made on both sides of that question. You could then broaden it out to question of conflict, boots on the ground, airplanes overhead, and how effective that is or is not. Yesterday at NATO, we saw NATO countries agreeing to join the coalition against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. That means non-combative engagement, helping hostile flights and that sort of thing. But I think you make the point yourself very well, Joe. This is not a problem that's going to yield to a particular individual solution. And even then, no matter how many solutions you care to combine, it's not one that's going to be dealt with any time soon.
Now, John, you're close to the Theresa May camp, and of course, following the dreadful terror attack in Manchester, we are now resuming campaigning in this general election, and the polls, or a poll, has indicated a dramatic drop in support for the Conservatives of 24 points ahead of Labour. They're now 5, according to that poll. What's the mood in the May camp?
Well, let's say first of all, Joe, and you don't need to be told this, this is one opinion poll. If we see a run of opinion polls over coming hours and days that support the idea that the lead of the Tories over the Labour Party has shrunk very significantly, I'm sure you will see some consternation in the Tory ranks. It's also true that polls do tend to move this way and that during the course of a campaign. And at the end of it, you often see a result not dissimilar to the position at the outset. We'll just have to see how that goes on. As for Theresa May's demeanour, well, I haven't had the pleasure of being very up close and personal with Theresa May so far today, but she is giving a news conference later on, and we'll have a chance to see how she reacts to all of this. And I think it'll also be interesting, Joe, to see how the transition from that post-Manchester outrage phase of a political truce moves very, very rapidly into one of engagement. I wouldn't expect to see the Prime Minister attacking Jeremy Corbyn on the question of security or anything else. In one way, she won't need to. That's now front and centre, very top of the agenda, and I think will be there for some time.
Right, John Pienaar in Sicily, thank you very much. Ian Collins, what do you make? It is one poll, and as I say, it has suggested this big drop, and you could understand if there were jitters in the Theresa May camp. Do you think there are?
I think there absolutely is, and I think they are the architects of their own downfall, frankly, on this so far. What's interesting is that within that same poll, Theresa May still comes ahead of Jeremy Corbyn
in the personal ratings,
and on the issue of security, which that sort of suggests that it might not be after, particularly because of Manchester, it's probably likely to be of the disastrous manifesto. A listener said to me this week, why are the Tories not costing their manifesto properly? I said, well, it's very simple. They're not giving you anything. There's nothing to cost, frankly. A few school dinners here and there, and that seems to be it. There's not a lot in there.
Well, you think it's a rather bleak retail offering?
Vote for us, we'll give you less, very much. And Corbyn's manifesto, whether you believe it or not, is very much this kind of wish list of very nice things that everybody's going to get.
I think there's a broader cultural problem that the Conservatives are encountering here, which is that Theresa May wanted to fight a presidential-style campaign on the proposition that you could just trust her, strong, stable, strong, stable, strong, stable. We knew the mantra. Now, if that's your core proposition in a campaign, you cannot afford to then let your manifesto slip through your buttery fingers and do a massive U-turn, look kind of weak and wobbly, as the phrase was. So I'm not sure Theresa May had actually established enough of a record of achievement to fight the kind of campaign she wanted to fight. So it was very brittle, and I think that's why it's softening. But absolutely, I think John's point was very important. This is mid-campaign turbulence. We need to be very careful about that.
But why bring up things like fox hunting, for example? I mean, the whole social care thing just didn't even need to be in their manifesto.
Or some might have argued that it was big and brave to actually tackle
some people say it's a bit of honesty, but it sort of seems to have backfired on them.
Or was it complacency?
I think it was a little bit complacent. I think they thought, and perhaps justified, because they think the people who turn out, older people, sort of the segment of voters who are backing Theresa May by a huge margin, they're in the right kind of seats. Maybe they just thought, we can afford to put up a manifesto that gives us license to do difficult, painful things. They might have underestimated the extent to which Labour could organise their own counter-proposition.
All right. Now, Monday's suicide bomb was the latest manifestation of Islamist-related violence in Europe. Sweden, Germany and Belgium have all suffered major attacks in recent years. But the worst affected country has been France, often perpetrated by its own citizens. As a result, the country has been grappling with difficult questions around integration and national identity. Questions that are now also being asked in this country. Ellie Price has taken a look at what happened in France and how the country responded.
January 2015, a gun assault on the office of the magazine Charlie Hebdo and a Jewish supermarket. Then in November that year, on the streets of Paris, gunmen and suicide bombers hit a concert hall, a major stadium, restaurants and bars in Paris, leaving 130 people dead. In July 2016, at least 84 people were killed in Nice after a lorry ploughed through a crowd celebrating Bastille Day. There were numerous other attacks too, on a smaller but still deadly scale. 240 people have been killed by terrorists since 2015. In the immediate aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo attack, the French government mobilised 10,000 troops on its own streets to boost security. Following the Paris attacks, a state of emergency was introduced. Meant as a temporary measure, it's been in place ever since, giving authorities powers to set curfews, ban mass gatherings, and it granted greater surveillance powers to the security services. Most of the attacks were perpetrated by homegrown terrorists, with a majority on the government's Fiche S high security watch list. Aside from missed opportunities by security services, many critics say this also points to failures in France's attempt to improve integration. In an attempt to address that, in 2011, France became the first European country to ban the full-face Islamic veil in public places. But it was a controversial decision that some argued created more problems than it solved. With one of the biggest Muslim populations in Western Europe, France is still coming to terms with its relationship with Islam.
And I'm joined now by the author of a new book, Terror in France, Jihad in the West, French political scientist Professor Gilles Kepel. Welcome to the Daily Politics. In the wake of a major attack, like this week's in Manchester, carried out by a terrorist who was born and lived in this country, it's inevitable that there are going to be questions asked about integration and shared values. Now, France has been grappling with this issue for many years, and I think it's fair to say it hasn't been very successful.
Well, no country has been successful, I have to say. And we suffered 239 people who died between the attack on Charlie Hebdo on January 7, 2015, and the stabbing to death of Father Jacques Hamel, the Catholic priest, in his church in Normandy in July 2016. And what was very striking was that even though the terrorists and the jihadists tried to take the French presidential election hostage of that, there were no successful attacks since then. And from July last year to the first round of the presidential election, except for a man who gunned a policeman on the Champs-Élysées, who had a sort of criminal record more than a jihadist record, the French authorities have been able to sort of get deep into those jihadist networks and foil most of the attacks that were planned. And for jihadists, it's a very important issue, you know, to enter into institutionalized Western politics in order to torpedo them. This they could not do because they had hoped that Marine Le Pen would, you know, make a landslide, because they would tell to their co-religionists, look, the French or the Brits or the Dutch or whatever are racist, they vote of the extreme right, so you have no hope in sort of integrating into society, you have to cling to your ascribed identity. And look at what they did in Manchester. They were able, to a large extent, to torpedo momentarily, at least, because the campaign was suspended.
But
for them, this is a great success.
But what I'm interested in is the causes behind this jihadist movement and why it arises from homegrown terrorists in countries like France and in Britain, and whether there is anything that can be shared in terms of lessons. Because France has a very different attitude and approach to secularism to the UK, it has a very different demographic of Muslim citizens, and therefore, would you agree, a different type of relationship between minorities and the wider population?
To an extent, but you know, when you deal with those phenomena, the issue is not only an issue of domestic politics, it's also an issue of global jihadism. What we are now confronting, and this I explained in the book at length, is what I call the third wave of jihadism. That is to say, in 2005, a Syrian engineer by the nom de guerre of Abu Musab al-Suri, who was trained in France, but then who lived for a long time in the late 1990s in London, which at the time we dubbed as Londonistan, because all the chief Islamists were around here. So decided that, you know, bin Laden had failed in this top-down jihadism, and then Europe was to be the locus of jihad. It was the soft underbelly of the West, and it was to be a sort of bottom-up jihadism that would see at the would-be soldiers of jihad the disenfranchised Muslims in the West. And this is something which creates a totally new understanding of this jihadism.
Right.
France was hardly hit. It is now less hit, and the focus has shifted onto Germany and onto
But
Britain.
France has been hit
definitely.
in a very major way, and some of the accusations have been France's failure to integrate parts of its Muslim community. And Britain would probably say that they have done a better job of that in broad terms. So what I want to get to the bottom is, do you think in the end that France's policies towards things like banning the burqa, for example, have they further alienated a Muslim community, or have they been the right things to do?
I don't think they have alienated further the Muslim community. I mean, I do not know whether the Small Heath model of communalism is something to be followed. And, you know, we heard people bragging here that, you know, the reason was why France was attacked because it was too secularist and so on and so forth. So then you had this great thing where Sharia council reigns supreme in parts of Birmingham, and the man who attacked Westminster two months ago was someone who came from those areas and those neighborhoods. So I think the blame game between France and Britain, to me, is totally irrelevant. This is not the issue. The issue is to try to understand why this jihadist ideology has been able to capitalize on disenfranchisement, whether it is because people think that they're too secular or because they're too communalist. But then we're facing a shared threat. And I think that, you know, lessons from what happened in France and from the fact that the French authorities were able to foil all those attacks and that the presidential election was not hostage.
Okay, well, let me bring in my other guest. Do you agree? I mean, do you think the key question here is why do people become jihadists? Now, the suggestion is that some of them are just criminals. Some of them are very vulnerable and therefore are vulnerable to being brainwashed by much more sophisticated people who are looking to commit these violent acts. And does our domestic policy play a part?
Well, this is a massive question. I think what's interesting is that you have to try and sort of disentangle what are causes of terrorism, what are the causes that lead people to go down the path of radicalisation, and what is moral culpability. So, for example, you can quite obviously say, and Jeremy Corbyn has said this today, as we heard earlier, say there is an element of Western foreign policy that is used, exploited by jihadis in their recruitment, and can be perceived as a provocation, which is very different from saying somehow morally the West has brought this on itself. You know, so you have to understand. It seems to me that ultimately, there's people have agency, and someone chooses to go and kill innocent people, and that is a sort of an absolute abhorrent moral thing that you have to condemn entirely, and then separately bring your analytical framework onto saying, how did that person get into a situation where they had sort of adopted a whole narrative view of the world, warped and twisted though it might be, that made them think that they had some moral imperative to attack innocent people?
I think it's about something more. I think this idea that it's about foreign policy, that it's about stuff we've done, is really a bit of a bit of a red herring in all of this. If you look at countries, we just mentioned Belgium, Sweden,
and France,
Madrid, of course, as well. I think this week in Jakarta there was also an IS attack as well there. I mean, you could look around the world at places that have not had foreign policy involvement.
But what about integration policies at home? Have they worked or have they failed?
No, I think they've completely failed, because we've also almost been a victim of our own levels of tolerance, because it's lovely to be tolerant, and who doesn't want cultural assimilation? But has it worked? Clearly not.
Right. Do you agree with that? I mean, you say you're a man of the left, you consider yourself a man of the left, but you are critical of the left in France because you agree with the comment made just there that actually the left has been too accommodating of Islamists in France.
I would like to go back on this issue of Jeremy Corbyn for a second.
No, because we're going to talk about that, if you don't mind, a bit further in a moment. If you could just answer that particular question.
Well, you know, François Hollande was the first man who was anti-Bashar al-Assad, who wanted terminated. The Brits and the Americans wouldn't follow suit at the time. and we were the worst targeted people. Those remarks, in my view, are totally, I'm not interfering to British politics, behind the curve. Now, integration. Have we failed? Haven't we failed? We have all failed, as you said, because it's not an issue of, you know, being the culprits or whatever. It's because we're facing an economic model which has changed completely. We're now deep down into digital economy. The French were probably amongst the Europeans least able to manage this change because of the heavily unionized system, because of a number of issues. And this is why Emmanuel Macron was elected, among other things, because this is a man who campaigned for Europe and who was elected. No politician, particularly in this country.
And that's why he won.
Yeah, exactly. And because he thought that, you know, he could address this issue of disenfranchisement. And this is a major point that we have to take into consideration.
Except in other parts of Europe, of course, politics has been polarised. Just before I let you go, Gilles Kepel, let's talk about the question you did want to answer before, which is, do you think Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, has a point? Do you agree with this idea that foreign policy has, to some extent, arguably, perhaps, driven some of what's happened?
Well, the mix of foreign policy and domestic policy is very important, and the borders have disappeared. You know, where are we? Are we in Europe here, or aren't we in Europe? Is North Africa part of France? Is France part of North Africa? To some extent, the sort of the empire strikes back paradigm is extremely efficient. So
our policies in the Middle East, do you think, have contributed to some of the violent attacks?
They're part and parcel, of course. And whenever there was an ISIS attack, they sort of claimed that, you know, it was a retaliation against the bombing of the territory or the caliphate.
You don't murder children, do you, because of foreign policy? I mean, that's
absolutely. Well, what they say, and this is why I'm sorry to say that I believe Mr. Corbyn buys into the Islamist narrative completely without any nuance. But when you know, I follow the chat rooms and everything, all those people, and they say precisely, you kill our children because of the bombings of the Assad thing, so we kill your children. It's a tit for tat, it's a rex talionis. But this is only the pretext, this is the propaganda. This is in order to galvanize, to mobilize
and to be
support.
A recruiting something.
Absolutely, but I think it does not work because, you know, when you kill children, there was an 8-year-old who was killed in Manchester on 19th of March 2012 in Toulouse. Mohamed Merah killed 3 very young Jewish pupils at a school. And they would legitimize that. They say, well, because Jewish pupils would be soldiers in the Israeli army in the future, so we're killing the would-be soldiers. But this, you know, functions only for the most hardcore people, but I think they do not manage to mobilize militants.
All right.
If you have violence, after a while, if it does not work, turn against its own perpetrators. This is why the jihadists had to change their models.
I have to end it there, but thank you very much. Now, with the general election firing on all cylinders once again, Jeremy Corbyn has given his first speech of the restarted campaign. Speaking in London today, he focused on counter-terrorism and presenting what he described as Labour's different approach to domestic and foreign policy. Jeremy Corbyn said that no government can prevent every terrorist attack, but he went on to say that it is the responsibility of government to minimise the risk posed by terrorists. He said that under a Labour government there would be more police on the streets. He also said that the security services will get more resources if they need them. And Mr Corbyn said that in the view of many experts, there are connections between wars our government has supported or fought in other countries, such as Libya, and terrorism here at home. But he also said that his assessment in no way reduces the guilt of the terrorists. He went on to say that an informed understanding of the causes of terrorism is an essential part of an effective security strategy. And Jeremy Corbyn said that the so-called war on terror is not working. He said that a future Labour government would think of what he called a smarter way to reduce the threat of terrorism. Here's some of what the Labour leader had to say earlier.
We must be brave enough to admit that the war on terror is not working. We need a smarter way to reduce the threat from countries that nurture terrorists and generate terrorism. That's why I set out Labour's approach to foreign policy earlier this month. It is focused on strengthening our national security in an increasingly dangerous world. We must support our armed forces, Foreign Office, international development professionals and diplomats, engaging with the world in a way that reduces conflict and builds peace and security. Seeing the army on our own streets today is a stark reminder that the current approach isn't really working so well. So I would like to take a moment to speak to our soldiers on the streets of Britain. You're doing your duty, as you have done so many times before. I want to assure you that under my leadership, you will only be deployed abroad when there is a clear need, and only when there is a plan that you have the resources to do your job and secure an outcome that delivers lasting peace.
That was Jeremy Corbyn. We'll be speaking to the Shadow International Trade Secretary Barry Gardiner in a moment. But first, let's hear from former Labour MP Tom Harris, who is in Glasgow. Tom, first of all, do you think it's appropriate to make a speech like the one Jeremy Corbyn has made today?
Yes, it's appropriate that we talk about the threat of terrorism. It's entirely appropriate that we have that debate because, frankly, we haven't really had that debate in the country so far. And if we're not going to do it in the aftermath of the terrible events in Manchester, then, you know, when else to do it? But I have grave reservations about the tone and the content of what Jeremy Corbyn is saying, because essentially, and I admit I haven't read every single word of the speech, I don't have a text of it, but as far as I can see from his reported comments, he's spoken a great deal about the culpability of the West, which is it's a theme that he has pursued for the last 30 years, and he said nothing at all about Islamism, which is actually the root cause of domestic and international terrorism.
Right. What do you say then to his broad theme that actually foreign policy, some of our foreign policy, could have contributed or does contribute to some of the violent acts that have been perpetrated in recent years? I
think he's buying into the Islamist agenda entirely. If you look at what ISIS themselves are saying, you know, ISIS are the most obvious representation of Islamism in the world. They actually have said unequivocally that even if you stop invading our lands, even if you stop torturing us and oppressing us, we will hate you, we will continue to attack you. Islamism is about hating Western values, it's about hating democracy, it's about hating the fact that in this country and in other Western democracies, women, heaven forbid, are allowed to leave their homes without their husband's permission. And that offends Islamists. And even if there were no invasions of any other countries, they would still hate us, they would still kill us. Can we remember that the World Trade Center was first attacked by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in 1993, 10 years before the invasion of Iraq?
But is Jeremy Corbyn right that the war on terror, to use that expression, hasn't worked?
Well, we don't know what level of terrorism we'd be facing if the particular military interventions launched in the wake of 9/11 had not happened. If anything, we have been far too tolerant of Islamism. We have we've kidded ourselves on that we can somehow negotiate with it, that we can come to some kind of understanding. Islamism is a dreadful death-worshipping philosophy which has to be defeated both militarily and domestically through policy, and there is no alternative to the end of this particular conflict.
But what, I mean, you voted in favour of the Iraq war, but has Jeremy Corbyn since been proved right by being against it?
I don't believe so. I mean, for a start, I mean, Jeremy offered the same objections to Iraq as, for example, he's given to every military intervention. In 1999, when NATO, led by Tony Blair, intervened in Kosovo to stop the murder of thousands of Muslim civilians, Jeremy Corbyn was there at the front demanding that military action should stop. And let's just think for a minute, if we stop our military intervention, what happens when the Islamists continue to kill our children when they go to pop concerts? What happens when we've done everything that the Islamists demand, that we've done everything that the Stop the War coalition and its Socialist Workers' Party allies say? What happens when we stop sending troops abroad to do good, and yet we are still the victims of this evil philosophy? What do people like Jeremy Corbyn then say?
All right, Tom Harris, thank you very much. And I'm joined now by the Shadow International Trade Secretary Barry Gardiner, and Conservative Johnny Mercer is in the BBC's Plymouth studio. What do you say in response to Tom Harris, who has said that Jeremy Corbyn has bought into the Islamist agenda?
Look, I say not at all, because what Jeremy is pointing out, and he was very clear in the speech, that there is absolutely no justification for the horrific events in Manchester on Monday night. Absolutely none. Nothing can justify that, and there is no equivalence, there's no moral equivalence in any way between British action abroad and the terrorist action that attacked that concert. What Jeremy has pointed out, though, is actually in tune with what the US intelligence services have pointed out, in tune with what Stella Rimington has said, and in tune with what Eliza Manningham Buller have all said. Two heads, former chiefs of MI5. Eliza Manningham Buller says, whatever the merits of putting an end to Saddam Hussein, the war was also a distraction from the pursuit of al-Qaeda. It increased the terrorist threat by convincing more people that Osama bin Laden's claim that Islam was under attack was correct. It provided an arena for jihad for which he had called, so that many of his supporters, including British citizens, travelled to Iraq to attack Western forces.
So are you saying that the Iraq war is the piece of foreign policy, British foreign policy, that caused or in some way led to the attack in Manchester?
No, absolutely not. There is no direct causal relationship.
Right. So
and
which
it would
part
be
of
foolish.
British foreign policy would you have changed to prevent subsequent terrorist attacks?
Look, what Eliza Manningham Buller is saying,
which I think to know what you are saying, yes, what Jeremy Corbyn is saying.
And I believe it's the same thing. What we're saying here is that you cannot ignore the recruiting sergeant effect of those conflicts, and in particular the way in which those conflicts were conducted without having stabilisation in the country in the aftermath as the primary focus, because we know that these terrorist groups actually thrive on instability.
So would you
That's
have
what
voted
they did in
against
Iraq.
airstrikes in Libya, for
I
example?
did.
So you voted against it, and you're saying...
Let me be clear, Joe. I was one of the 13 people who did vote against the airstrikes in Libya. And look at what is happening in Libya today. Women are being sold in slave markets in Libya today.
Let's put that to
because of the complete failure to stabilise that
Let's
country.
put that to Johnny Mercer, because Johnny Mercer, there has been a massive political vacuum in Libya, and Britain has been criticised for not having followed up the airstrikes that were conducted there. And, of course, Salman Abedi's family is from Libya. What do you say to Barry Gardner's point?
I'd say to Barry and anyone watching that the Libyan intervention at the time was done on a very specific challenge of rescuing a group of people who were going to get massacred. At the time. Yes, you know, what has happened in that country is of deep regret. You can see the challenges that are there, but I just do not accept that doing nothing is always the answer. I think Jeremy Corbyn's speech today, it belies a complete misunderstanding. These terrorists, they use that narrative after they've done something. You know, things like the World Trade Center, it all happened before Iraq. It's just making things up to get elected. And the fact that, you know, this guy could be Prime Minister in 2 weeks is just extraordinary.
Right. Joe, it's not about doing nothing. Let's be absolutely clear. What Jeremy has always been clear on, and I think what many people in this country are clear about, is that military action, where it is sanctioned by the United Nations, where it is done in concert with other countries, and where it can have a clear plan to stabilise the country that is being attacked or intervened on, that is something that, I mean, you know, the one of the military interventions that actually Jeremy did support, of course, was East Timor, which precisely had all those bits in place. That was what the big conflict that Robin Cook resigned over about Iraq. Was it going to be sanctioned by the United Nations or not? And the point is this, in any of these conflicts, in Kosovo, what happened at the end was Russia had to be brought into play to make sure that we had the wider international community to broker a peace.
But Tony Blair went in on a humanitarian basis without a United Nations security, so Jeremy Corbyn would not have done that.
Indeed, he wanted at that stage to have a wider international involvement. And if you look at what happened in Kosovo at the end, that is what took place.
But in the end, as you say, that's your measure, it's going to be always that there has to be a United Nations security resolution before Britain will get involved in any military action.
No, not of course.
Well,
not of course if it's to defend an ally in NATO or if it's to stop this country under direct attack.
Right.
Those are separate situations.
Johnny, can I just move on? Johnny Mercer, the Labour leader, said that Jeremy Corbyn said that the UK cannot be protected and cared for on the cheap. And he's referring directly to the cuts that have been made by both the coalition government and the Conservative government since to both the police and our armed forces. And he's right.
He's not right at all.
Those cuts have taken place. I've got the numbers here in front of me.
OK, so counter-terrorism has been protected, hasn't it, since 2010? It's been increased since 2015. Since 2015, defence expenditure is going up. But the specific budgets that you're talking about, counter-terrorism and going against these threats, it constitutes a whole load of efforts, whether it's the Prevent programme, whether it's within the intelligence services, whether it's in the police, and you have a certain amount of money and you try and challenge what is going on and meet the threat that we are facing. So yes, you can say there are less policemen or there are less people in the armed forces. Does that mean we have less capability? No, it doesn't.
Right, okay.
If it was simply in numbers, then North Korea would have a fantastic army, wouldn't they? But they don't.
But isn't
and it
it a myth?
misunderstands the problem.
But you can understand why the Labour Party is either, capitalising, if you want to use that word, on the fact that the Tories have long claimed that you are the party of law and order and the armed forces. When you look at the figures since 2010, the number of soldiers, for example, it's gone down from 102,300 to 78,600.
But Joe, I've just come back on this numbers figure.
Let me
it
just
doesn't
finish.
make sense.
Let me just finish. It's just that if you are going to talk tough after a big attack like this, and it looks as if we don't have enough boots on the ground, are people going to lose faith?
The issue with this counterintelligence fight is that a lot of it is kept from the public domain for reasons of necessity. The idea that what we've done has contributed to a failure of the war on terror. I mean, it's not only pretty offensive to those of us who took part in it, but how could Barry or Jeremy or anybody else on this seemingly sort of magic roundabout on foreign policy ever think what the UK would be like without some of the efforts that we've seen from our brilliant security services who have been resourced? Yes, there are challenges around the economy that crashed under the Labour government in 2010. But how would anyone ever know what the UK would look like today?
All right,
I think it's pretty disingenuous. If you look at that war on terror and what people have contributed in this country for the freedoms that we enjoy, yes, one has got through in Manchester. It's desperate. It's terrible for the people there. But let's have a bit of reality. We live in a safe world, a safe country. We're very fortunate. We've got brilliant security services.
Right.
Yes, we must work harder.
Isn't it wholly disingenuous, Barry Gardiner, to imply, or for Jeremy Corbyn to imply, that there is somehow a link between our intervening in conflicts abroad and terrorism at home, or that it has acted as a recruiting sergeant? How do you explain the attacks that have occurred in the Muslim world and killed thousands of Muslims? Is that our foreign policy to blame for that too? What about the deadly attacks in places like Madrid in 2004? They weren't involved in the Iraq war. It killed 192 people. Was that down to foreign policy?
No, look, let me be absolutely clear about this. The Islamist worldview existed prior to all of these things, and it is there. What Jeremy is talking about, indeed what Eliza Manningham Buller and Stella Remington are all talking about...
I know you're very keen to try and bracket...
Well, what I'm trying to say is the radicalisation of young Muslims in this country...
As a result of British foreign policy.
Is helped by them using it as a cause célèbre. But let me go back to the point that you were making about the policing.
All right.
And
just a point of fact for our audience. Okay. Which way did you vote in the Iraq war? Was it for or against?
I voted in favour of going to war in Iraq.
Right. Well, that totally contradicts everything you have just said in this interview. So you voted for something that acted as a recruiting sergeant.
I did. And perhaps that was my mistake. But within 4 weeks,
it wasn't a mistake now.
But within 4 weeks of that conflict, I was in the House of Commons at the debate on the Tripartite Committee, arguing that we were not doing what we should have been about stabilising that country and leaving people from the army with their weapons to go back without any income, and that is exactly the chaos that we left behind.
Right, and I will pick that up with Johnny Mercer on the chaos. But please, hang on. Can I just finish? Because it's important to get the narrative here and the logic, because as we know, and as you have said, many attacks took place before the recent foreign policy interventions that have been taken by successive governments. No, but in terms of, are you saying that our foreign policy should now be guided, in order to avoid being a recruiting sergeant, it should be guided on not upsetting anyone? No, but if we're not going to have if we're going to have a foreign policy that's not, in your mind, going to act as a recruiting sergeant anyway, let's take Libya for example, because actually the Manchester bombers' families were opponents of Gaddafi in Libya, and you might say that RAF airstrikes were crucial to him being toppled. And in fact, the Abedi family had fled Libya and come here to escape Gaddafi's regime. They went back to Libya. So in a way, they should have welcomed that intervention.
But they didn't. And actually what we had was a chaotic state in that country, which enabled the terrorist groups to set up their camps, to train people, to radicalize people through that warped ideology. The point I want to make, though, about the policing is that the police are the frontline intelligence service with our communities in the UK. We've seen so many young men from the UK who have become radicalized, who've become these terrorist bombers. We need the police on the front line, talking with the community, gaining their confidence, having that intelligence.
And was that not what the prevent strategy is supposed to do?
And on this occasion, we know that 4 or 5 times that was made, but it didn't get through.
Let me bring him others. I mean, one of the points that Barry Gardiner has raised is a valid one in the terms of the aftermath of these conflicts. Do you agree with him that actually in the case of Iraq and in Libya, Britain left, or the West left, these countries to chaos?
Yeah, of course. And we famously now know, and to the cost of many, that clearly what happened afterwards, the legacy, what should have taken place after Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, obviously, wasn't good enough, and we can only learn from that going forward. However, that isn't the reason why somebody decides to blow up small children in an arena in Manchester. Absolutely. And I think Jeremy Corbyn is, and Barry, you know this, he's on a hiding to nothing. I mean, to try and look tough and trying to be tough on defence-based issues. Look at his backstory, exactly. Look at where he comes from, look at what he stands for. He's a pacifist CND member. He said he couldn't, when even asked by Andrew Marr, would you take out an ISIS member, he couldn't even say it. And this is a man that wants to be taken seriously on national security.
And isn't that the point, that this is a weak issue, actually, electorally for Jeremy Corbyn, because, of course, some parts of the press have talked about his past associations with members of the IRA or any connections that he might have with groups like Hamas. And in the end, it's a trust issue for the British people when they come to vote in this election.
I think, obviously, it's problematic when you look at Jeremy Corbyn's record in the past, referring to Hamas as his friends, associating with Jerry Adams within weeks of the Brighton bombing. These things will be perceived by people as suggesting that this is someone who sees the force of the British state as one of the bad guys in the world, and that's not a good look for someone who wants to be Prime Minister. But specifically on the speech that he's just made, the thing that I find problematic about it is it's all entirely retrospective, and as I said earlier, you can apply all sorts of different analytical frameworks to why we have the causes of terror, but the proposition he's actually putting to the public in an election campaign is we should have a smarter policy. Well, of course we should have a smarter policy, but I still haven't heard anything that articulates what that actually consists of. There's no diplomatic engagement with ISIS. There's no political solution actually available for negotiating with these people. So actually what he's offering is kind of an elaborate hand-wringing, and I don't really see what his actual proposal to the country is on this stuff.
And on that we have to end. Johnny Mercer, thank you very much, and Barry Gardiner too. Now, manifestos are always full of fine-sounding commitments, but as John Major used to say, fine words butter no parsnips, and voters want to know how all those extra billions for schools or the NHS are going to be paid for, which taxes are going up and which benefits are being cut. That means cold, hard numbers, something some politicians seem to have trouble with.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
How much will they cost?
They will cost. It will cost.
Where will the extra 8 billion come from?
Andrew, what we have done, if you look at our record, is shown that we can put record sums of money into the National Health Service at the same time as we're ensuring that we're building that strong economy. And that's what we'll do for the future.
What is Britain's deficit at the moment, Mr. McMahon?
If I can say to you that what's happening as well in terms of day-to-day expenditure.
Did somebody pass you a piece of paper? What is our deficit at the moment?
Not at all.
How much money are you going to raise from cutting winter fuel payments?
Well, it depends where we set the level.
No,
we said we'll consult on that. We know it
okay,
costs about £2 billion.
Most of that £2 billion?
We'll see, because we haven't, as you know, set the
exactly.
It
is an uncosted black hole document.
Is it a waste of time for me to ask you how you're going to pay for something that's worth 40 billion?
Well, I'd be patient, Andrew. It's just a couple of more days to go.
But where will the money come from?
Well, it'll be a priority area for us, so we will find that money.
But so you haven't been able to show us a revenue line where this 8 billion will come from.
Now, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, or IFS, has analysed Labour and Conservative manifestos and compared their plans on public spending, the public finances and reforms to taxes and benefits. I'm pleased to say. To discuss their findings, Carl Emerson, their Deputy Director, is here with me now. Welcome to the show. Now, the parties tell us that their policies are all fully costed and transparent, aren't they?
No, they take risks. Labour has a plan to increase public spending considerably. They would keep the deficit around its current level, so borrow a lot more than the Conservatives. And they would raise taxes significantly. Now, they think their tax raises would get them about £49 billion. We agree that they'd get a lot of money from their tax policies, but we think even £41 billion would be optimistic in the medium term, and they'd get less in the longer run. So with Labour, there's a clear risk. What will you do if your tax raises don't get you the money that you expect? We don't think they would bring in the money they want. What would they do then? Would they spend less, perhaps rein back on those promises, or would they put some other tax up?
Right. Now, you say they're being optimistic in Labour's case. We'll come on to the Conservatives in just a moment. But to be fair, they have put some costings together because presumably otherwise you wouldn't have been able to make your value judgments.
Indeed, we've been able to go through the numbers they've provided, and we've been able to see where they've gone for what we would describe as an optimistic rather than a central estimate. We can see where we think literally they have just made a mistake, and we can see where where they will genuinely raise a lot of tax revenue, and that's why we're able to say we think 41 billion rather than 49 would still be a bit on the optimistic side. Open question about what they would do if faced with that kind of shortfall. Now, you also say Labour's plans would bring taxes to their highest ever peacetime level. How do you come to that conclusion? So with an increase in the tax burden of about £41 billion, our number's not theirs, they actually think they'd do more, it would put tax as a share of our economy above the levels we saw in the early 80s, above the level we saw at the end of the 1960s, so it would be at its highest level since 1949-50. Now, so that's a very long while in a historical sense. If you compare it internationally, actually lots of advanced economies have much higher tax burdens than we do. So this would move us up to about mid-table in terms of tax as a share of our economy. It would move the UK to a kind of Canadian position rather than, say, a Scandinavian position. Right, and you say that Labour's public sector pay plans will cost £9 billion extra. How did you work that out? We've looked at how much we spend on public sector pay, included the pension contributions, included the national insurance contributions that go alongside that. Under the Conservative government, they would keep the 1% pay cap in place, which would clearly take a big risk with recruitment, retention of public sector workers. Under Labour, they would delegate it to the pay review bodies. If they recommend that pay goes up in line with private sector workers, which we think is a reasonable neutral assumption, you would be able to mitigate a lot of those risks about recruitment and retention, but it would mean public sector employers faced with a £9 billion rise in their pay bills. But, as we said earlier in the programme, you commented that this is a retail offer being made by Labour. Whether you believe the figures or not, is it appealing? It's about mood music, isn't it? In terms of how the electorate look at these things. You're looking at Theresa May's manifesto, which may be brutally honest. It might just be fiscally upfront about, look, we haven't got any money, so we can't spend it. We've got to relook at social care, even if you don't like how we're doing it. We will be putting more money into it. We're beginning the process. Labour, but we're not giving you anything above that, a few school meals here and there. Labour have got this big old list, which, by the way, doesn't include, I think I'm right in saying, the cost of renationalisation. That isn't in their spending plans, which would be like a sort of mini Brexit for every industry you try to renationalise. Yes, what do you make of the fact that there weren't detailed costings for renationalisation? Well, there aren't. It's correct to say there aren't. They've said that they would nationalise the Royal Mail. They would have public sector companies operating in every region in this water, would be like a mini railway, Brexit for every single one of them. That would all add to public sector debt. Enormous costs. Figures? Do you have any ballpark figures? We don't have figures on that. Would you be able to estimate what the figures would be broadly? No, because we have no sense of the scale or the timing of this. Right. We do know it would mean they'd be on course to miss their fiscal target, though. Right, because, of course, they have promised to balance the books on current day-to-day spending. Now, let's look at the Tories, because you say the Tories will cut £11 billion from benefits, reducing the incomes of the lowest income working age households significantly. Is that in the manifesto? It's a continuation of current government policy, so it's not in the manifesto. There's no, in fact, so whoever's the next Chancellor, if they choose to change nothing, you would see £11 billion worth of working age benefit cuts roll through the system. As, for example, universal credit gets rolled out, it's much less generous than the system it's replacing. So it was a glaring omission? It was not being fully honest about what the implications of a Conservative government would be. I mean, that's a big amount of money, which, of course, it's not in the manifesto.
the Conservatives can argue that it is continuing government policy, but £11 billion being cut from benefits will very much hit working-age households.
It will, and it will be felt by a lot of people, and a lot of people who are in seats that are either currently held by Conservative MPs or that MPs are intending to win, and those MPs will suddenly find themselves putting in a need to put a lot of pressure on a Conservative government, if indeed the Conservatives win, to say, hang on, you can't do this to my constituents. And I don't think the Conservative Party has been honest with itself about that. And part of that is the underlying problem here is that you had 5 years during which the Conservative Party under David Cameron and George Osborne organised the entire political argument very effectively around the need to deal with the deficit and the debt, and that this was the overarching kind of priority in all the politics. And then suddenly they've completely gone. Brexit is the issue. Theresa May's the Prime Minister. She's inherited that agenda, but not the political will to make that the central argument in British politics. And she's not making that case. And actually, that case is now feeling a little bit stale and old. And I don't think Theresa May has properly grappled with that change.
Right, well, let's talk about one of the big issues that Theresa May and all the politicians have focused on to some extent, and that is immigration. And Mrs May's plan, she's obviously restated that pledge to some criticism, but you are saying that her plans to reduce immigration to the tens of thousands will hit both the economy and the public finances. How can you work that out?
Well, we know from the government's own forecasts that when in November it revised down what it thought net immigration would be over the next few years, it revised down tax receipts 4 years out by about £6 billion. So we've seen that already in the books. That was a revision down to about 180,000 a year net immigration. If you want to take it down by another 80,000, get it close to tens of thousands a year, that's going to hit you for about £6 billion a year in 4 years' time, and that number will actually grow over time. The more years you hit that target, the more it will hit the public fund.
Is that a price worth paying, Ian?
I think probably from an electoral perspective, I think absolutely it is for the Conservatives, because they will look at
immigration still topping the economy.
This is incredibly popular. Most polls suggest people would like to bring it down, measured, not get rid of it, but just control it.
But how do you explain then the low tax receipts? I mean, if the tax receipts go down that dramatically, if you
they
take
only go down because you're suggesting jobs will go as a result of immigrants not being here. Well, wouldn't they just simply be replaced by people who currently are looking for a job? Are we seriously suggesting that Costa and Cafe Nero will be suddenly empty and barren and tumbleweed going through them because nobody wants to work as a barista?
We seriously are suggesting that if there are more working age people coming to Britain wanting to work, there'll be more people employed in this country. And actually there isn't a fixed number of jobs in the economy, and if we have people who want to come here and want to work and we decide we don't want them here, that's a cost.
So jobs get created because they're here, or while they're here they take jobs that are currently available?
Yes, but of course they would argue, I suppose, that employment levels are quite high at the moment.
Well, at the moment we've got record employment, haven't
right.
we?
So there aren't that many. Well, there aren't that many people looking to perhaps take some of the jobs that will become available.
But I think there would be enough. I just can't imagine that our economy would collapse, and coffee bars and that hospitality area, which is obviously an industry that does attract lots of people who are coming in from Europe, an example, they're not going to just suddenly close down, are they?
Right. Is this the IFS just predicting doom and gloom? And, you know, what I mean, forecasts are marvellous to some extent, but most people would say it's not scientific enough to actually become true.
Well, there's certainly huge amounts of uncertainty. We can plan on the basis of the best forecasts we've got. That doesn't mean the world is going to turn out exactly as we predict. Things could be better, things could be worse. I mean, there are certainly lots of risks in these proposals. I think with the Conservatives' manifesto, the biggest risk perhaps is the fact that when you look at their NHS spending plans, when you look at their school spending plans, they're really not that generous. And what we don't know is whether, you know, if it is the case that that leads to a deterioration in the quality of those public services, would they end up having to top those plans up, or would we just live with public services that were less good?
But is this based on your idea that Brexit is going to provide uncertainty rather than opportunity?
It's based on the government's own forecast for the economy over the next 5 years from the Office for Budget Responsibility that they produced in March. So it's the government's own estimates.
Just finally, it is true, isn't it, that if we don't have a strong economy, if tax receipts go down, then neither government will be able, potential government will be able to fulfil their plans?
Yes, absolutely. The most important line in the Conservative manifesto is the one that says we will leave the single market and the customs union. They haven't explained how you do that in a way that preserves the stable growing economy that we happen to have at the moment. And if you don't have an explanation for that, the rest of the numbers, the rest of the forecasts, what you're planning to do, could go either way. It's practically
You
voodoo.
can't fit that in a manifesto, though, can you?
Yes, but that is the line that will determine the most about what happens to this country, and the rest of the manifesto is completely hypothetical on whether they can actually do that in a way that protects the economy.
Do you think there is more of a focus on public services now, which has played into Jeremy Corbyn's?
Yeah, I think there has. Again, it's about mood music, and that poll has closed for a reason. The one we've seen today, as we said, it's only one, but it's closed for a reason. Mood music, he's giving you loads. The Tories suggesting they're being more prudent, I suppose.
All right, we'll have to end it there, Carl Emerson. Thank you very much. Now, as part of the BBC's general election coverage, our very own Adam is talking to the main party leaders in-depth interviews. Andrew, I should say. Tonight it's the turn of the Labour leader. That's the Andrew Neil interviews with Jeremy Corbyn tonight at 7 o'clock on BBC One. But that's it for today. Thank you to all of my guests, particularly to you two, though, for being guests of the day. And the 1 o'clock news is starting over on BBC One now. I'll be back on Sunday on BBC One at 11 with the Sunday Politics. Make sure you join me then. From all of us here, bye-bye.
The pressure is on with quick-fire questions from Richard here.